I was a little late to the 1 o'clock game, so I put on WIP. Mike and Merrill, their ability to get an ad in 15 minutes before the game is unprecedented stuff. They crammed in like 20 ads within 15 minutes. I mean, the devil works hard, but the WIP salesmen work harder. It was funny because Merrill looked at the windows, like the windows of Lucas Oil Stadium at one point. And he goes, and look at those beautiful windows. And this is brought to you by Pella Windows and Doors.
I know that Merrill's like, I think
he should have retired.
80,
you mean
80 years old? Say what?
I said when he should have retired.
Well, I mean, that's a discussion.
Years ago?
Oh, here comes the hot takes.
No. Listen, man. We did a story about this like years ago, I think, and it got so lambasted that I think did Kyle delete it or somebody took it down or something like that because nobody like you wouldn't dare criticize Merrill back then, and like now it's whatever, but it's the same shit that we talk about like when we do these stories like Dick Stockton or like Lee Corso or whatever. Like you want people to go out when they're like still relatively on top.
Yeah, Lee Corso's a very good example of like probably should have pulled the plug figuratively, not literally.
Yeah,
about 4 years ago.
Yeah, and I don't know what the case is with Merrill. I mean, like they've got a spotter, right? So you see the guy up there with the binoculars who's like telling him, "Hey, it was number 15 or something like that," And I don't know what the decision is like that. I would be interested to actually get feedback from listeners or from Crossing Broad readers. I mean, like, do you guys still listen to the WIP broadcast? Do you think Merrill still has it? I mean, should he call it quits? I'm not sure. It's always such a like tough topic. You know what I mean?
So many people are so tied to the nostalgia act of it that it's like, to me, right? Like I look at two other announcers who became like iconic or tied to their respective team in sport. One is obviously Harry Callis, who I think you could argue was still at the top of his game when he passed away.
Agreed.
Now baseball is a different sport, not as much action going on. There is the ability to have breaks in between. There is the ability to pass Harry a note about, pitching matchup. Harry also let the game breathe a lot. He wasn't filling every second with, his commentary. The other one is Mark Zumoff, who chose to go into retirement at the top of his game. Is it sad? Yeah, like definitely, because I think Mark Zumoff had many more years to give at the top of his game and like at the height of his craft. And like, what a shame that like he went through so many awful years towards the end of his career, in terms of the team he was covering versus like, whatever we want to say this team is. Like in theory, this team could still be like sort of, relevant, they finished top 4, whatever. Another one, I guess, like Jim Jackson. Some people love Jim Jackson, some people don't. But like Jim Jackson is just as sharp as he's always been. Now, none of these guys, with the exception of Harry Callis, are as old as Merrill Reese. And you could make the case that because of where Merrill is, it's not like he's in Wells Fargo Center where he's on top of the action. Like he's out a bit. I don't see it. I don't get it. I will admit that I didn't grow up listening to Merrill on the radio, so I don't have the nostalgic factor. So I look at this objectively and say, it's just, it's not sensational commentary. If it's the soundtrack of your childhood and like your adolescence and your young adult life, and that's why you like Merrill so much, it's fine. But like the quality to me just isn't, it just isn't there. It doesn't live up to what I think people talk about Merrill as being. It's not quite as drastic as like the people who point back to the days that there was the deli counter behind, the slicer behind the Wawa deli, but like things have gone down over time. I don't see a scenario where they like send Merrill off to pasture, feels like they're just going to let it up to him. And I feel like it's going to be too long,
Yeah. I think that's what like people have to start making that hard decision where it's like you lead it. You have to at one point be like, hey, listen, we got to get a plan in place. You got a year, you got 2 more years. And then unfortunately we got to pull the plug and you just, if it's a blowback and the guy disagrees with it, you deal with the blowback. But at the time when it comes around, like you don't want to get a Lee Corso situation. Like watching Lee Corso on game day. And I don't think he's been on it for like the last 5 weeks. And I don't know if they're just like saying he's in the hospital or he's saying he's dealing with a medical emergency, or they're just kind of like, dude, we can't have Lee Corso on here. And that's why they brought Pat McAfee in like week 2 or week 3, because it was just
Corso only does some
didn't he?
spotty.
like a couple years ago. Didn't Corso have a stroke?
Yeah,
Like,
he
wasn't
had a
that the
medical
whole
issue like a
thing?
couple years
Yeah,
ago, but
yeah.
and but like if you watch the first 2 weeks without McAfee, it was just like, dude, this is tough because they would get rolling, and you go to Lee Corso, and the show would just deflate.
But here's kind of like the overarching point, and this is kind of what Russ is alluding to. It's like you want to be remembered for being the best and being at the top of your game, and we're only ever going to look back at Zumoff as that, right? Because he never let it get to the point where he was anything less than at the top of his game. You know what I mean? And maybe that's the same with Jim Jackson, but they're not affording themselves the opportunity to be remembered for anything less than that. Merrill only has to call 17 games a year, right? So I think like in the case of like Zumoff or Jim or anybody else, it's like that's a grind doing that full year with like your 81, 82 games or whatever, and having to do the travel that they used to do before the pandemic. So I think it's almost apples to oranges when you're comparing football to basketball and to baseball and to hockey for sure. But I don't know. I don't want people to think it's like for me, it's not an anti-Merrill thing at all, because I don't listen to the radio broadcast. I kind of pay attention to the TV broadcast, and we talk about that in the stories that we write. I just don't want it to get to a point where people are like actively saying like, hey, Merrill's got to like, somebody has to go to Merrill and tell them like, hey, that's it. Like you want people to make those own decisions. You want people to wrap it up naturally. You want to remember people for being at the top of the game. You don't want to get to like a friggin' Jason Peters thing where it's like, dude, this guy should have retired 4 years ago. You know what I'm saying? Because we think now, but here's the point. We think differently of Jason Peters now.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Because he let it go on for 3-4 years. Now he's a Cowboy.